When an existing band tries to cash in on the latest fad, it's always awkward. But it gets even more awkward when said existing band were a bit of a fad themselves. You actually see this more often than you might think. A lot of artists at the end of their 15 minutes of fame wind up flailing around desperately for an album or two, frantically attempting to maintain their prominence in the mainstream or restore lost record sales. And that's pretty much where Kiss come into the picture. For those of you who may be living under a rock, Kiss were a glammy hard rock band from New York City who had a real flair for showmanship and a deep love of sloppily played hard rock. It was basically shock rock for people who thought that Alice Cooper was just a little bit too intellectual. And in the mid to late 70s, these guys were huge. They had multiple gold and platinum selling albums, lavish tours, millions of adoring fans, their own comic book, toys, and even their own movie. And that movie is one of the most amazingly bad things I've ever seen in my life. I would actually recommend it even if you aren't a Kiss fan. But all was not well within Kiss, because by 1977 personal tensions had emerged and were taking a significant toll on the band. The group's management offered up a plan to simultaneously solve this problem while also, and I quote, bringing the group to the next level. The solution offered by management was for each of the 4 members of Kiss to produce a solo album that would then be released on the same day in 1978 and collectively would be counted as the next Kiss album. 40 years on, we tend to look at the 478 Kiss solo albums as an overambitious, arrogant, failed experiment. But at the time, these albums were expected to sell handsomely, and when they didn't, it was taken as a serious blow to the band. And while the failure of the solo albums really has more to do with the fact that most of them aren't very good, it also revealed to the band that they were massively overexposed and really had nowhere to go but down after this point. And I think the band members knew this, because when it came time to make their next album, they chose to do what virtually every multi-millionaire superstar who's about to lose relevance does, which is to frantically grab at whatever genre is hot at that particular moment in time. And in early 1979, that genre was disco. Dynasty came out in May of 1979, and while it was the massive success that Kiss had hoped for, largely due to the crossover disco single I Was Made for Lovin', it deeply alienated long-term fans with its more commercial and polished sound, and marked the beginning of a 3-year, 3-album period in which Kiss made multiple unsuccessful attempts to switch genres and regain the critical and commercial success that they had enjoyed during their golden age of the mid-70s. So today, we are all conscripts in the Kiss army, because this is Dynasty. This has got to be one of the most notorious examples of a band trying to cash in on a contemporary fad ever released by anybody. And back in the day, this song ticked off Kiss fans like nobody's business. A Kiss song that your mom or girlfriend could get down to? Blasphemy. Well, almost 40 years later, I've got to say that I really dig this track. It's got a great bass line, I love the drums, and, I mean, it helps that I enjoy disco, so there's that. But honestly, this is just a good song. Although I will say that what I find offensive is not that it's disco, it's the fact that Paul Stanley had to go to a corporate songwriter like Desmond Child in order to get something like this.
Well, my name is a number. It's on.
So Kiss follow up their big sellout disco single with a cover of an old Stones song, 2000 Man, off of the Their Satanic Majesty's Request album. And if you've watched my channel for long, you'll know that I'm usually not a big fan of covers, especially when bands try to cover the classics. But Kiss really do this song justice, lending it a rough garage band type vibe that was sort of there on the Stones' original recording, but mostly buried under layers of whimsy and English psychedelia. And Ace's rough, somewhat shaky vocals really lend themselves to this impression as well. It's one of the best Stones covers I think I've ever heard, even if I do still slightly prefer the original version. Sure Knows Something sits very firmly in the this shouldn't work and yet somehow does category. It's a heavily R&B tinged pop rock song, and probably my favorite song on this entire album, if only because it's basically the closest that Kiss ever came to doing a funk song. Peter Criss's one composition on this album is mostly notable for being the last time he would appear on a Kiss record until well into the 90s when they did their big reunion. And it's also the only track on this album on which he plays drums. And when you listen to this, in comparison to the rest of the album, you can definitely tell that this is a different drummer. The song itself is decent but mostly unremarkable. It's got some nice guitar and I really like the bass line. But honestly, in my opinion, the song is about a minute longer than it needs to be. And on top of that, Peter Criss, for as uneven as that album was, did songs like this much better on his solo album from the previous year. Charisma is one of only 2 Gene Simmons tracks on this entire album, and musically I like it a lot. Of the more standard hard rock songs on here, it's one of my favorites. Lyrically, however, I'm not such a big fan. It's about Gene wondering what it is that makes him attractive to women, which is a good question because anybody who's ever looked at Gene Simmons has also asked themselves this as well. However, Kiss are by no means the first band to sing about this. This was an often pondered upon topic for songwriters in the 1970s, with probably the most obvious example that springs to my mind being the song Is It My Body on Alice Cooper's 1971 album Love It to Death. Magic Touch is a nice, if somewhat slow and methodical, pop rock song from Paul Stanley. And again, of the non-disco tracks on here, I like this one a lot. Even if, unlike Charisma, I do kind of tend to forget this once I'm done with the album. It's not that it's a bad song, it's just that I don't find it to be tremendously memorable at all. Although I will say that I do like this Paul Stanley falsetto moment. If only because it does remind me a bit of what was to come in about 2 albums' time. Hard Times is a great, heavy song about growing up on the mean streets and trying to make your way as a troubled youth. It's the second Ace Frehley song on the album and the first original composition. And honestly, of the non-disco songs on here, I think this is probably the best, in spite or maybe because of the fact that this basically is an Ace Frehley solo song. There are no other members of Kiss on here. He plays all the guitar and the bass, and the drummer, just like the rest of the album, is a session musician. Other than the Peter Criss song, X-Ray Eyes is probably my least favorite song on this album. There's just nothing interesting happening here, aside from some weird background synth noises in one part of the song. It's just standard pop rock, and it goes on far too long for what it is. And by this point, I'm starting to notice a trend here, being that if it wasn't written by Ace Frehley, it doesn't really rock on this album. And sadly, that's going to remain the case for pretty much the entirety of this record. I like Save Your Love quite a bit, if only for the beautiful irony of the fact that this is a Kiss song about turning down sex, of all things. But I'll be the first to admit the song has quite a few problems. It's about a minute longer than it probably should be. You know, songs like this probably shouldn't be more than 4 minutes, never mind almost 5 minutes. And it's just the weakest of the 3 Ace Frehley songs on the album by a long shot. Hard Times was great, and he did a wonderful cover of 2000 Man, but this is dipping into rejects from his solo album territory, and that's usually not a good thing, because if it wasn't good enough for your solo album, why is it good enough for the group album? This album is for the most part pretty good. The disco and the R&B influenced tracks are fantastic, but the rest of the album is a lot more mixed. The Ace Frehley tracks are almost uniformly excellent, while the Paul Stanley songs are good, but there is a dud or two. And both the Gene Simmons and Peter Criss songs are very, very mixed. And to be honest with you guys, I honestly wish they'd done a little more with the disco and R&B on this album, because for whatever reason it worked really well for them. And they made some really good stuff. The production is a bit of a mixed bag as well. It works very, very well for the disco and the R&B stuff, and even some of the more pop-oriented rock songs. But when you actually get into the rock songs, the production really lets them down. The songs on here have a sort of wimpy, defanged production that is totally absent from their earlier albums. And everything except for the Ace Frehley songs is just way too slick for its own good. And while the Ace Frehley songs on this album are excellent, and they're probably the best part of the album aside from the disco songs, I will say that they are not as good as the best stuff on Ace Frehley's solo album, and overall, I actually think the solo albums hurt this album a lot, because it seems like everyone involved, except for maybe Paul Stanley, used their best stuff on the solo albums, and then Dynasty itself was just kind of the sloppy seconds, at least in terms of the deep cuts. The actual singles are pretty good. While Dynasty was a very successful album, and it did make the band a lot of money, ultimately it was the beginning of the end for them. They alienated a lot of fans with this, and they continued to alienate fans throughout the early 80s, as they put out first a power pop album in Unmasked, then some sort of bizarre attempt at prog with Music from the Elder, an album which I have no explanation for, besides that Bob Ezrin was apparently coked out of his mind during the early 80s. And then they finally settled into 80s metal with Creatures of the Night, and they've basically spent the rest of their career, at least up until the late 90s, just shamelessly trend hopping, be it early 80s metal or late 80s hair metal or grunge or what have you. But, you know, despite what its reputation would suggest, this is actually a pretty good album. It's by no means the best. To me, I'm a bigger fan of Kiss. In fact, really the only time I'm a big enough fan of Kiss to buy their albums is when they're confused, don't know what they're doing, and they're just kind of desperately flailing around trying to get a hit, which is exactly what they were doing on here, and it's exactly what they were doing on both Unmasked and Music from the Elder, and that trio of like the Lost in the Wilderness years are really the only albums from this band that interest me a lot. There's something about when bands just don't know what they're doing, and they just kind of fumble around wildly trying new and different things in an effort to be successful, that is absolutely fascinating to me. I like Alice Cooper's early 80s new wave period for a lot of the same reasons. But in any case, it's a decent album. Maybe don't buy it first. Definitely not if you're a hardcore fan of their earlier stuff, but certainly don't avoid the album forever. And until I come back with the long-awaited next review of the overambitious and bloated album series, I'll see you guys later.